I work around water allocation systems, the reservoirs, the release schedules, the agreements deciding who gets water and when, and right now, engineers are draining a reservoir on the Wyoming border to save a different reservoir 400 miles south. That's Flaming Gorge, feeding Lake Powell, sitting at 25% capacity with a bathtub ring clearly visible from an airplane. The plan moves up to 1 million acre-feet in a single year. Here's what nobody says loudly enough. This move used to require 3 separate reservoirs. Now it needs 1, because the other 2 are already too empty to help. I want to say that part again, slower, because it matters more than the headline number does. 3 reservoirs, now down to 1. That's not a footnote buried in a press release. That's the entire story compressed into a single sentence, and almost nobody sat with it long enough to notice what it actually means. Let me back up, because the official version of this is calm, procedural, and, frankly, boring on purpose. The Bureau of Reclamation announced an emergency drought response. Interior Secretary Doug Burgum signed off on it. Governors from Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico put out a joint statement about difficult but necessary coordination. That's the press release version, and it sounds like adults responsibly handling a hard situation. To be fair, some of that is genuinely true, but the word emergency is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. And the more I look at the timeline, the less convinced I am that it's earning it. Here's why. This is not the first time this has happened. It's the third. In 2021, under something called the Drought Response Operations Agreement, signed back in 2019, so this tool has been sitting loaded and ready for years, the Upper Basin states coordinated the first ever joint release from 3 reservoirs at once. Flaming Gorge gave up 125,000 acre-feet, Blue Mesa gave up 36,000, Navajo gave up 20,000. Total, 181,000 acre-feet, all routed toward Lake Powell to keep it from dropping too low. Officials called it unprecedented, historic, a one-time coordinated action, the kind of thing you do once and then never need again. Then 2022 happened, and instead of needing less water the following year, the system needed more. Flaming Gorge alone released 500,000 acre-feet that year, stacked on top of 161,000 already pulled from Blue Mesa and Flaming Gorge before that. Total contribution for the year, 661,000 acre-feet. Officials called that one unprecedented too. I want you to notice that word getting reused before I even finish the sentence. Now it's 2026, and Flaming Gorge alone is being asked to release somewhere between 660,000 and a full million acre-feet because Blue Mesa and Navajo don't have enough water left in them to participate at all. Officials are calling this one unprecedented as well. Okay, 3 unprecedented events in 5 years is not an anomaly anymore. That's a pattern with a press release stapled to the front of it every single time it happens. I'm not saying anyone lied to the public. I'm saying the word emergency implies something rare, sudden, and unpredictable. And what I'm actually looking at is a tool being used on a fairly tight repeating cycle. Those are not the same thing. When I see an emergency mechanism activated for the 3rd time in 5 years, my first question stops being what caused this specific event. My question becomes, why does the system keep landing back in exactly the same spot? So let's talk about why that spot matters, because this is where the physical engineering comes in, and it isn't trivia. It's the reason this crisis has a hard floor underneath it instead of just a soft, worrying number. Lake Powell isn't just a scenic lake behind a dam. It's the reservoir behind Glen Canyon Dam, and that dam generates hydropower for a huge chunk of the Southwest. The system has a hard number baked into its design, 3,490 feet. That's the minimum power pool elevation, the lowest the water can drop before the dam physically can't spin its turbines anymore. Not shouldn't. Can't. Below that line, you don't get reduced power. You get 0 from that facility for everyone downstream who is counting on it. There's a second number, 3,525 feet, the target elevation, a 35-foot buffer built specifically to give operators warning time before hitting that hard floor. Here's the detail that bothers me professionally. That buffer was never designed to be a permanent place to live. It was designed as a tripwire, a warning light. And what I'm watching right now is a warning light being treated as a comfortable operating zone. Picture the actual shoreline for a second, because this is not an abstract spreadsheet problem. That bathtub ring people keep photographing from the air isn't paint. It's mineral staining left behind on rock that used to sit under 50, 60, sometimes over 100 feet of water. Boat ramps that used to end at a dock now end at dry, cracked mud, and marinas have had to physically relocate their launch points further and further down the slope every single year, chasing a shoreline that keeps retreating. That's the visible version of 25% capacity. It's not a number on a chart. It's infrastructure stranded above water that used to be there. As of late March 2026, Lake Powell sat at 25% of live capacity. The trigger wasn't one single dramatic event. It was the poorest snowpack on record, stacked with a record-breaking heat wave in March that torched whatever snow was left before it could melt slowly into the river the way it's supposed to. Snow that should have been feeding the system gradually all spring just didn't show up on schedule, and heat did the rest of the damage early. Here's a detail from an earlier drought year that explains the forecasting problem in miniature, and I think it's more revealing than anything in the press releases. In one stretch, Reclamation's own inflow projections for Lake Powell dropped by roughly 2.2 million acre-feet in about 2 months, January into February. 2 months, 2.2 million acre-feet gone from the forecast, not from the reservoir, from the prediction itself. That's not a rounding error. That's the system getting blindsided by its own weather models in real time. When your emergency response depends on catching problems early, and your forecasting keeps getting ambushed by dry winters that, at this point, aren't exactly rare anymore, you don't actually have an early warning system. You have a system that reacts fast once it's already too late to plan calmly. And this is where the monitoring gap becomes the real villain of this story, more than any single official statement. Snowpack forecasting for a basin this size depends on physical snow course measurements and remote sensing feeding models that project runoff months in advance. When a dry January turns into a drier February, and then March adds a heat wave on top of it, the model isn't just slightly off. It's chasing a moving target that keeps sprinting away from it. The public doesn't see the forecast get quietly revised downward multiple times before an emergency gets announced. They just see the emergency announcement itself, which makes each one look like a sudden shock instead of the tail end of a forecast that had already been sliding for weeks. That gap between when the model starts sliding and when the public finally hears about it is where all the unprecedented language gets manufactured. That's the first reversal, and I want to name it plainly. The plan looks proactive on paper. The timeline underneath it says reactive. Now here's where it gets genuinely tangled, because the drought response agreement isn't the only lever being pulled. It's stacked on top of older machinery. There's a 2007 set of interim guidelines that already governs how shortages get declared and shared between the upper and lower basins. There's a 2024 provision layered on top of that, letting reclamation temporarily limit releases out of Glen Canyon Dam beyond what the older guidelines alone would allow. And there's the 2019 Drought Contingency Plan itself, which was never just the reservoir release piece. It also included a weather modification program and something called a demand management program, aimed at paying water users to voluntarily use less. So when you hear emergency drought response, you are actually hearing about at least 3 overlapping legal tools being used together, stacked like patches on a tire that keeps losing air in a new spot every single year. That's not a technology that's failing. That's a technology, the legal and operational kind, being asked to do a job it was designed to handle rarely, now running practically every season. I also want to be fair to the deeper history here, because none of this started in 2019. The entire allocation system underneath the Colorado River dates back to a 1922 compact that divided the river's water between 7 states based on flow estimates from an unusually wet run of years. That foundational math assumed more water existed in the system than the river has reliably produced across most of the last 2 decades. Everything downstream of that original overestimate, the drought contingency plans, the interim guidelines, the emergency drought response tool getting used a 3rd time right now, is essentially a series of patches trying to manage a shortfall that was baked into the original agreement almost a century before anyone was talking about climate change publicly. That's not an excuse for how this specific plan is being run. It's context for why emergency keeps needing to be invoked at all. Here's the second reversal, and it's the one that actually made me stop and reread the documents twice. The solution being used right now literally cannot be repeated at this same scale next time, and almost nobody says that part out loud. Go back to the 2021 release, the 3 reservoir one, Flaming Gorge, Blue Mesa, Navajo, all contributing together. That was the model. That was supposed to be the flexible toolkit, spreading the burden across multiple storage units so no single reservoir absorbs the full hit alone. It's a reasonable idea on paper. Diversify the pressure, don't concentrate it. But in 2026, Blue Mesa and Navajo are explicitly excluded from the plan, not because officials decided to spare them out of some new fairness policy, because their water levels and inflow forecasts are too poor to contribute anything meaningful right now. The tool that was built around 3 reservoirs sharing the load has quietly become a tool where 1 reservoir carries all of it, because the other 2 ran out of runway to give. Flaming Gorge was sitting around 82 to 83% full going into this plan, genuinely one of the healthier reservoirs in the entire system, which is exactly why more than one water official has called it the low-hanging fruit. Under this release, it's projected to drop to roughly 59% by the time the year is finished. That's not water disappearing into thin air. That's water being physically moved. Flaming Gorge is essentially being asked to spend down a chunk of its own stability to cover for a system that has run out of other places to borrow from. I want to be precise here, because this is the part people skip past too fast. Propping up one reservoir doesn't happen in isolation. At the same time, Flaming Gorge is releasing water upstream. Reclamation is also cutting how much water leaves Lake Powell downstream through Glen Canyon Dam, reducing the annual release from about 7.48 million acre-feet down to roughly 6 million. So the plan isn't simply add water here, it's add water here and hold back water there, which means the shortfall doesn't get solved. It gets relocated. It gets pushed further down the system, onto Lake Mead. And Lake Mead is not some abstract line item on a spreadsheet somewhere. Reclamation's own estimates say this move could cut hydropower production at Hoover Dam by up to 40%, which lands directly on Nevada, Arizona, and California. So what gets described publicly as a rescue plan for Lake Powell is, mechanically, a pressure transfer. Somebody, somewhere in this system, always ends up absorbing the deficit. Right now, it's whoever happens to be sitting downstream of the fix. That's reversal number 3, and it's the one I think the press releases are least interested in spelling out clearly. There is no free water anywhere in this system. Every acre-foot that shows up somewhere left somewhere else first, and somebody, somewhere, felt that departure. Let's talk about who's actually standing in that gap, because this stops being an abstraction the second you look at the actual people involved instead of the acre-foot totals. The Jicarilla Apache Nation, whose water comes off the Navajo River, one of the very reservoirs now too depleted to help with this plan, reported receiving only 25 to 35% of their contracted water allocation. That's not a rounding issue for a tribal water attorney trying to figure out whether her community can meet basic domestic needs. Jenny Duma, who represents the nation, called the current plan a short-term solution and said, and I'm paraphrasing the substance of her point here, that it will take real time to recover these reservoirs before a move like this can even be attempted again. Sit with that for a second. The person standing closest to the water rights actually being affected isn't calling this a fix. She's calling it something closer to a loan the system may not be able to repay quickly, on a river basin that's already showing tribal communities the sharpest edge of the shortfall first, before anyone downstream even notices a change. Meanwhile, upstream at Flaming Gorge, Local recreation businesses are watching boating access shrink earlier in the season than normal, because the water level that supports marinas and boat ramps is the exact same water level being sent downstream to keep someone else's dam spinning. Farmers and ranchers across the upper basin states were already being cut off from irrigation water before this specific plan was even finalized. Picture a rancher checking a headgate that simply isn't delivering the allocation it delivered 5 years ago, on a schedule set by an agency 4 states away, reacting to a snowpack report from months earlier. Picture families in small reservoir towns watching the local economy shrink, one closed boat rental at a time, not because tourists stopped coming, but because there's less lake to put a boat on. None of that shows up in the acre-foot totals in a press release, but it's the actual texture of what 661,000 acre-feet released means on the ground. This was never a story about one lake. It's a story about a chain of obligations where every single link is under strain at the same time, and the strain doesn't distribute evenly. Now, the governors of the 4 upper basin states, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, Wyoming, did push back on one point, and I think it's the single most important sentence in this entire saga. They said, essentially, that any water released from Flaming Gorge and other upstream reservoirs needs to be fully recovered once the emergency period ends. That sounds reasonable on its face. It also sounds like a promise nobody has actually stress tested yet at this scale, because there isn't a clean public record confirming full recovery after the 2021 and 2022 releases to point to. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm saying nobody has handed me the receipt, and full recovery is exactly the kind of phrase that sounds like an answer while functioning like a hope. That's not proof of failure. I want to be fair here because precision matters more than outrage, but it is exactly the kind of gap that should generate more questions, not fewer, especially from anyone who's watching the system for the 4th or 5th cycle in a row. There's also a money question sitting underneath all of this that rarely gets asked out loud. Coordinating releases across multiple reservoirs, running the hydrologic modeling, managing the legal sign-offs between 4 states and a federal agency, none of that is free. Every round of this drought response involves public agency staff time, monitoring infrastructure, legal review, and interstate coordination costs that taxpayers are funding whether or not anyone ever sees an itemized bill for it. I don't have a verified dollar figure for what the 2026 coordination effort specifically costs to run, and I'm not going to invent one just to make this sound bigger than it is. But I don't need an invented number to make the point. When the same emergency mechanism gets funded and activated for a 3rd time in 5 years, the cost isn't just the water moving between reservoirs. It's the standing cost of keeping an emergency system permanently on call, which is usually a sign that the emergency stopped being rare a while ago. Here's the part that genuinely gets me, professionally, more than any single number in this story. The 2019 agreement that created this entire drought response mechanism, the one being invoked for the 3rd time now, was only one piece of a larger plan. The other major piece was supposed to be long-term structural reform, brand new operating guidelines for how the whole Colorado River system runs once the current rules expire. And as of this recording, those post-2026 operating guidelines are still unsettled. The emergency lever keeps getting pulled on repeat, while the actual rulebook meant to eventually replace repeated emergencies hasn't been finished. 7 states, multiple tribal nations, and the federal government are all supposed to land on a shared long-term framework before the current rules expire. And as of this recording, that negotiation is still open, still contested, and still without a public finish line. Most people who follow this process closely agree on one thing. More emergency interventions like this one are likely before any durable, long-term agreement actually gets signed. That's not a hopeful forecast. That's water managers openly admitting the stopgap is going to keep being the plan for a while longer. That is not a technology problem. That is not purely a weather problem, even though weather is clearly the trigger pulling the alarm each time. That's a sequencing problem in how the whole system is being managed, leaning on the emergency backup mechanism as if it were the primary strategy, while the actual long-term plan sits unfinished on somebody's desk, year after year, drought after drought. Think for a second about what a properly managed system would actually look like here, because this is the standard of care question I keep coming back to. It wouldn't treat a 5-year-old drought contingency plan as a bottomless well you can dip into every couple of years without consequence. It would treat 3 unprecedented invocations in 5 years as a 5-alarm signal that the underlying allocation math doesn't work anymore under current climate conditions. It would prioritize finishing the long-term operating rules with real urgency instead of leaning on Flaming Gorge like a designated understudy every single time the snowpack disappoints everyone again. And look, I'll give credit where it's due. Coordinating 4 state governments, a federal agency, and a tribal nation's water rights inside a single operating plan is genuinely hard, unglamorous, thankless work, and the people doing it are not cartoon villains twirling a mustache over a spreadsheet. But standard of care in water management isn't about good intentions under pressure. It's about whether the system was built to anticipate this before it became urgent, or whether it's permanently one dry winter away from another unprecedented announcement. Right now, it's the second one. That's not a technology failing. That's a plan that keeps getting asked to do the job of a long-term policy it was never supposed to replace. I keep hearing officials describe each new round of this as unprecedented, and I understand why that word is useful publicly. It signals seriousness. It signals decisive action being taken on your behalf. But professionally, when I watch a supposedly rare emergency tool get activated 3 times in 5 years, escalating in scale each time, and shifting from a 3-reservoir model down to a 1-reservoir model because 2 of the original 3 ran dry, I don't read that as bad luck repeating itself by coincidence. I read that as a system that has quietly redefined the word emergency to mean something closer to Tuesday. And here's a small, dry, uncomfortable truth underneath all of it. The snowpack does not care how the press release is worded. It doesn't care about coordination statements or joint agreements between 4 governors. It melts, or it doesn't, on its own schedule, regardless of how many times officials describe the response to its absence as historic. So here's where I actually land on this. This was never a mysterious environmental surprise that caught competent managers off guard. It's the predictable output of a river basin running on more promised water than actually falls as snow, propped up repeatedly by a mechanism that was explicitly built to be occasional and has quietly become routine, while the real long-term fix, the operating agreement that's supposed to finally replace this cycle, still doesn't exist on paper. The mistake here isn't any single decision made in 2026. It's treating a drought response agreement as an ongoing management strategy instead of the narrow emergency exception it was originally designed to be. And the physical fact underneath all of this hasn't moved an inch. Flaming Gorge is still sitting up there on the Wyoming border right now, dropping from around 83% toward roughly 59%, quietly absorbing the shortfall for a reservoir system 400 miles away. Lake Mead is still downstream, waiting to see exactly how much of this deficit eventually lands on its own hydropower numbers this fall. The snowpack that failed this particular year will need to not fail again, repeatedly, for any part of the system to genuinely stabilize on its own. Nothing about the underlying math has actually been solved by any of this. The water simply got moved from one place to another under a calmer name. And next spring, when officials stand up again and call whatever comes next unprecedented, I want you to remember this conversation because that will make it the fourth time in 6 years they've reached for that exact word to describe the exact same underlying problem.